Salvate omnes and welcome to this week's video tutorial. Our topic for today is going to be Vergil praises the rustic life. And as you can see, this is from Vergil's famous text, the Georgics, called by the English writer and substantial poet during the Elizabethan era, John Dryden, the best poem of the best poet. And as the title suggests, Vergil urges a return to traditional Roman values as exemplified by the virtuous, pristine way in which the Roman farmer and his family live. So let's jump right into it. We got some vocabulary over here on the margin. And the first couple sentences are a little bit tricky, but with careful looking up of the vocabulary and attention to grammatical form and concepts, I think we can be successful in our reading, translation, and interpretation of this justly famous text. It begins with O nimium fortunatos agricoles, quibus facilem victum divitissima terra volens fundit. Otium iucundum, agri longe patentes, speluncae vivique lacus. Mugitusque boum dulcusque sub aborre somne am eis ner absunt. Inter eos iure et legis deutius manent, scalera prohibentur. Vivit felicitur qui ratione potuit causis rerum cognoscere atque luce scientiae metus omnis et pessimis curis et sui mente expolit. All right, so we got about half of the text read aloud. Let's go back and see if we can unpack this a little bit. As noted several times, we're going to need to know our vocabulary. So I'm going to give you kind of a straightforward rendering of these words, and then we'll go back and talk about the syntax and the grammar and translation and interpretation. O is just an interjection. O. Nemium is an adverb, and once again, we have our Whitaker's words, which you will need to do on your end or use a German, or not German rather, but Latin dictionary, which would be even better. So here is our adverb: too much, very, very much, beyond measure, excessive, too great. So as often the case with translation, you'll need to play around with those various possibilities to see which one fits best for that context, that style, and that sense of the language. So, oh, too much, fortunate, farmers. Quibus is a relative pronoun. To whom, so we need to be familiar with that as well. So my guess is you do not as yet have full command of the adverbs which need to be memorized, as well as in this case, the relative pronouns. And you can see it's to whom or to which, because we have either the dative or the ablative as two possibilities. Again, only the context will help us decide which one fits. Sometimes you do have both options, but it's important to recognize that this is a relative pronoun. Who, that, which, what is the most common, but in this instance, because Latin uses cases either in the dative or ablative plural. Facilem, where we get the word facile in English, and also facility as a kind of derivative, means easy. Victum we have over here as a noun meaning food, sustenance, means of living. Divitissima is the superlative form of rich. Terra, earth or land. Volens is our present participle, willing. And then fundit, which they also give us over here, is our verb, in this case in the third person singular, agreeing with the noun and subject in the sentence, namely the earth. So what's tricky about this one, once you take the time to look up the vocabulary, is we need to decipher what the noun is in the sentence. Well, as it just indicated, is terra. How do we know that? Well, only terra has a nominative ending. In this case, it's in the singular. Why is that important? Because it agrees with the verb, which is also in the singular, namely fundit. So we put it all together is the earth willingly pours forth. But as noted, this is a little bit tricky because we have this rather late in the sentence. We could write this, but I'm going to go ahead and start back here, noting that fortunatos agricoles are both in the accusative. Fortunatos is second declension, accusative plural. But then also we have the agricoles, which is first declension, accusative plural. So this is a chance for further mastery of our declension endings. So, oh, great fortunate farmers. So I'm going to go ahead and, as you should be doing as well, is write this down. To whom, there's our quibus. To whom what? To whom the earth willingly pours forth easily rich food. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down, and then I will explain that in greater detail. Oh, great fortunate farmers. There's our quibus, to whom or in this case, I'm going to keep it a simple participle, willing. Again, a little bit tricky because if we don't recognize terra as the subject, we may be confused as to the subject and hence the overall meaning of the sentence. Divitissima, we should know, is isima, isimo, isimus is a superlative form. That's where we get words like divine and also dividends. So having something to do with richness, good and quality, I think is something we can take away from it. And we've already indicated that here is the verb. And the earth is giving to the fortunate or blessed farmers these facile richness of food, which is kind of the overall theme of the text in terms of Virgil's praise of the rustic life or traditional Roman life as Virgil understands it. Continuing here with otium jucundum, agri longe patentes, speluncae vivique lacus mugitusque bovum docusque, sub abore somne ab eis non absunt. So this one also is a little bit tricky to recognize what the subject is in this case. It's actually the first part, namely a joyful leisure. So I'm going to write that down, then I'll explain that a little bit further. Otium means leisure in Latin. We have words like otios in English. But if we look up the word here, you can see it's a neuter noun. So even though it ends in it's not accusative in this instance because we need a subject, and by analysis of the sentence, this is really our only option for the subject. So here we have another example of a neuter noun with bellum. So we've had this before. So both the nominative and the accusative are and then we have our adjective jucundum agreeing in case and number with that noun it's modifying. As you know, by now Latin tends to put adjectives after the noun it's modifying, whereas in English we tend to put it before. But then otium jucundum, and then literally long open fields. So agri is second declension, nominative plural. Longe is our adverb in this case, functioning as an adverb, and then patentes is open, like a patio or a patent, if you will. So looking that up would tell us that. This one's also a little bit tricky because we have a third declension word patentes agreeing with the second declension nominative plural agri. And so this one can be a little bit tricky in terms of deciphering that syntax. But let me go ahead and write that down. It's always a good idea to write it down as you work your way through the sentence. You can always go back and revise that translation. But this is the nature of reading and translation when it comes to Latin, is working your way through the sentence or through the language. A joyful leisure. All right, so I've gone ahead and since I worked through this reading and translation earlier, I've gone ahead and just written this out. And now I will explain this. And so, otium jucundum, a joyful leisure. Long, longe, open, patentes, agri, fields. Speluncae, they give us that word over here. It means cave or grotto, but since it's AE, we do have it in the plural. So speluncae, in this instance, I've read it as caves, although you could say grottos as well. Caves and fresh lakes, for literally vivacious lakes, so vivique lacus. They also give us this as well. Here it's important to recognize that the original Latin has a macron telling us that lacus in this case is of the fourth declension. As you can see, us tends to be the common ending for fourth declension. Mugitusque is lowing, bellowing, mooing. Again, we don't write all three, we choose one. But then boum, here you can see it, they're telling us it's in the genitive plural. This is rather a poetic form of this word if we look at our noun declensions. So here is our third declension, genitive plural, ending in and then it's simply following the vocabulary here. And we put it all together, you can see that what I've done with this is put it all together, mooing oxen, and then the resting pleasantly, that's going to be this part right over here. Somni, could also read that as sleeping. I chose resting. Of course, insomnia is lack of sleep. So once again, when you look up these words, you'll have options. Sub arborre, under a tree, and then dulces in this case can mean sweet, or I've translated this as pleasantly. Again, looking up the words will help you with that, but we need to recognize that it is agreeing with the mooing oxen or the mooing cows. And then not absent, but not far, in this case, right, from them. In fact, let me take a look at that. Change that to the plural. Okay. So, oh, great fortunate farmers. So the ace is referring back to the farmers because that's in the second declension ablative plural. So ab eis. And so only the context will tell us it's referring back to the agricolae because this pronoun agrees in person and number with the antecedent, but of course it changes the case depending on its function in that particular clause. So to summarize, these first couple of sentences are a little bit tricky, although I want to say again that a lot of it is just the unfamiliarity with vocab. If you know the vocab, it's certainly much more intuitive, but then as always, you need to figure out what the subject is in the sentence and then try to be creative with the syntax so that you can read it in a way that's natural for native English speakers. And then simply in translation, we can be a little bit more practical. We're not going to publish this, but rather just write it down for our own comprehension. And I think I've done that successfully. And hopefully you have something similar. Next part is a little bit easier just because the sentence is shorter. And so we're going to always use the vocabulary as a kind of stopping point. So inter eos is among them. And then manent means remain. And then what we have is remain for a long while. We've had this word diotios is where we get the word duration. And then iore legis is, once again, this is something that you need to be doing on your end to give you confidence that, but you can see it just depends on how we're reading that iore. Could mean swear, call to witness, vow, obedience, law, legal system, code, right, duty. That's what I've chosen in my particular instance. Justice, court, oath. So Vergil often is beautiful to read, but not tricky to translate, but it requires some imagination and sense of the style of the text in order to come up with a what would be an acceptable, smooth translation. So what I've done here is among them remain since long duty and the laws. So let me go ahead and write that down, and then I will explain that in a little bit greater detail by further reference. So there's our inter eos, and then manent. So far so good. Among them remain the diotios. That can be a little bit tricky. If you want to say for a long time, I'm going to keep it since long, give it kind of a poetic rendering. And then iore, I chose duty and the laws. And so it's this idea that the simple life as represented by the rustic life is the basis of duty and laws according to ancient Roman customs. And then what else is going on in this rustic way of life? Well, crimes are prohibited. So scalera can also mean sins. So if we wanted to kind of extend that, we could say crimes and sins are prohibited. The suggestion there being perhaps that these are more common with an urban lifestyle, a city life, as people and communities transgress towards empire. This is a theme in Vergil's writings. Crimes and sins tend to increase, and seemingly that this transgression of the natural moral laws as suggested in this text are less common in a more naturalistic, original state of living. Crimes and sins are prohibited. So scelera prohibentur. And then this is a beautiful sentence here, is he lives happily. So this takes a little bit getting used to in terms of how to read this accurately. So if you're not familiar with reading quality literature, this might be a little bit tricky, because he lives happily is not normal everyday diction or speech. But I'm going to go ahead and write that down. Vivit, of course, vivacious. We've had this word before. Vivit means to live. So if we're not sure, we can look this up. But you can see it's present, active, indicative, third person singular. He lives. Survives or resides, I think that misses the point. That would be a bad reading. So I'm going to go ahead and write that down. And I'm going to go ahead and just finish that thought while I have it here, and then I'll go back and I'll elucidate it with the original Latin. All right, so what a wonderful sentence, consistent with the Roman mentality. So he lives happily, but then qui is a relative pronoun who, but then who what? Who was able, but then was able by reason. So this one, we need to be able to recognize that this is in the ablative singular, ratione, third declension. I assume you have this out in front of you. Third declension, ablative singular, ends in E. So who lives by reason. So he lives happily, who was able by reason. Cognoscere means to know, like cognition or cognitive. But then to know what? Well, here's our accusative direct object, first declension, as, the causes of things or of all things. So there's our rerum, which, as we saw earlier with bovum, when you look on your declension chart, is third declension genitive plural. So there's our for rerum. And then you can match some of these other declension endings as well to get the right case. So he was able to know the causes of all things, and also by the light of knowledge. Luce scientiae, expelled. And then we have a series of direct objects in the accusative, all fears and bad cares from his mind, or I put from the mind. So really beautiful sentence, and I think an important idea, a rather important sense of the Roman way of looking at life in those words. Moving on here to the next part, let us read. Neque bella acria illum terrent, neque saevi exercitus, neque cetera pericula quae saepissime homines timent. Divities et honores ille nantam fortitur amat, ut velet beneficia vitae rusticae amititera. Cum paupersit tamen ille sibi veditur par regibus, cum filii parvi illius ad eum celeritur accurrunt, et cara oscula liberime offerunt. Huic di immortalis fideletur culti, pacem perpetuam dant, vitam similitur beatam quondam erunt Romulus et Remus. You can see that at the end of the passage, the text refers back to two of the founding figures in Roman mythology and history, namely Romulus and Remus, Rome, of course, being named after Romulus. Going back to the Latin here, and again, talking about this mindset of these fortunate farmers, neither fierce wars scare him. So in this case, referring back to this happy person. So this person is scared not by fierce wars. So illum is referring back to the man, in this case him, nor savage armies, nor other dangers which often scare men. So let me write this down and then I'll go back and talk about it in just a tad more detail. So you can see that the theme of the contrast between an idyllic rustic life and a competitive empire-driven life, namely civilization. And so we see that with the fact that he who lives a rustic life doesn't succumb to the pressures of empire and hence the requirements of survival, including wars and other kinds of military temperaments. So neither fierce wars. What's interesting about this one, we need to recognize that it is in the nominative plural. In fact, the word bellum is actually in our chart in the singular, so bella would be the plural, so wars, and then we have fierce. We've had this word before, ending in a. That's our adjective agreeing in this case with wars, so fierce wars. And then we already talked about terrify him, savage armies, and then other dangers. We've had this word before. That often, or most often, so saipe is often, saipissime is most often, and then scare men. Men, of course, is in the third declension, accusative plural. So there is our es right there, so homines. But what else does the text tell us about the virtues of this rustic life? Such a man, so ille is the man, as you'll see, loves only those riches and honors that are beneficial for a rustic life. So let me go ahead and write this down, and then I will once again try to explain it in a little bit more detail. So our subject here is he rather. So ille, I've translated a little bit more freely, but such a man. And you can see that that in this case that he loves, he only loves uh, those riches and honors. So here is our direct object. So divities is first declension, accusative plural. Honores is third declension, accusative plural. So he only loves those riches and honors only insofar, could also sort of be the sense that they are beneficial. So we do have the verb in the subjunctive, but really we don't need to go into that. It's just the nature of the ut clause. And then that are beneficial for a rustic life. So there is a sense in which that these honors or these riches and honors are only pursued insofar as they don't lead to the loss of the benefits of a rustic life. So I've kind of interpreted that a little bit more liberally, because amitere does mean to lose, but the idea is that excessive acquisition here, Vergil follows the Greek philosopher Plato. The excessive pursuit of gain tends to become tyrannical in one's life and repress those other desires of the soul that Plato, as Vergil, often define as moral, intellectual, and spiritual in nature. So riches and honors are earned and even valuable, but only to an extent is, what seems to be the point here, I believe. Cum, as you know, cum can be very tricky rather. So this is where we might want to kind of refresh our memory for our options. You can see it can be a lot of things. In this instance, it's not a preposition because the word that follows is not in the ablative. So, but then still it's a little bit tricky. I'm going to go with although in this case, and just because I think we do have a contrast between the rustic life and the city life, or the life of the metropolis, if you will. So it's important to take our time and just kind of, because you can see here, this is not an ablative ending. So we're going to interpret this as a conjunction, not a preposition. So let me go ahead and write this sentence down as well from my notes that I did before this lesson, and then I'll explain it in greater detail. Okay, let's go back and look at this. So the seat is in the subjunctive, but again, that's just the unique nature of Latin. So although he is poor, that is, the farmer may seem in material terms poor compared to those who pursue the life of empire. Although he is poor, tamen means nevertheless. Nevertheless, he sees himself, sibi. So he sees himself on par. And then here we have our ablative of comparison, regibus. So we can take a look at there it is, the ablative, because the rex is third declension, so regibus. So although he is poor, nevertheless he sees himself on par with kings. Why? Since his small children, filiae parvis, ilios, literally the small children of his, run to him quickly So he has family. He may not have riches, but he has family. And what do the children do? They freely, you don't have to buy their love, right? Whereas you have to buy things, seems to be perhaps one way to read that. They freely offer um, literally dear kisses. There might be a better way to to read that and translate it so it doesn't sound so fleshy. But the idea is that you can't buy love, that it's given freely. And it seems to be, according to this text, one of the virtues of the rustic life is that these natural passions of love are more readily offered in a rustic life, um, and they don't need to be bought. Huik can be a little bit tricky. Remember, that is the dative demonstrative pronoun. Hik, hai, hok. Huyus, 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 huik. So huik is our dative demonstrative pronoun, and it means these. So we could, as always, I cannot stress enough to look up the words. So, but it is a pronoun in the dative, and it's the plural, so these in this instance. So what we have is these immortal gods, faithfully, literally faithfully cultivated, but perhaps faithfully worshipped. Okay, these immortal gods, faithfully worshipped, give perpetual peace. Romulus and Remus, here's our verb here, lived a similar blessed life. So I'm going to go ahead and write this out for us, and then I'll elucidate it a bit further. As noted earlier, the reference to Romulus and Remus of some literary and historical significance when we talk about ancient Rome and its founding and its very tradition-oriented way of living, but by tradition it also laid the foundations by a kind of handing down, which tradition means. Tradere means to hand over. By handing down of some important values that not only the Romans, but even today, many people want to experience in their own lives to help orient themselves in the world. So kind of going back to the Latin a little bit, we mentioned that these immortal gods, there's a reference to the gods and pietas or piety. This one, a little bit tricky, but we have a little bit of vocab here. Of course, this is fidelios, faithfully. So faithfully worshipped, I like a little bit better than faithfully cultivated. And then here is reference to the gods. Give, that's simply going back to chapter 1. Give perpetual peace. Notice that am is first declension accusative singular. Pacem, pax is third declension accusative singular. So that's fairly straightforward. And then, which may be a little bit tricky about this is actually our subject and verb. We almost got to read this backwards. Egerunt is important because it reminds us once again, I'm just going to put in the present tense, but you can see here is these are our principal parts. So eg is first person singular, but of course this is perfect. And so, in fact, let me go ahead and just put that up a little bit more clarity. And so this is third person plural of the perfect form. And of course, the context is they in this case, right? So I'm reading this as they lived. Why? Because you live a vitam, or you live a life. And then, of course, this life was blessed. That's where we get the word beauty or beatitude. And then quondam means once. And this simple life of the farmers, the rustic life, is not only a godly or divine life, de immortalis, but if properly cultivated or worshipped, it can lead to a kind of inner peace. And Vergil wants to suggest, the text wants to suggest, that these virtues were an important part of Rome's founding, as indicated by the reference to Romulus and Remus.